Hello and welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News, your every Monday geopolitical news show that addresses whatever main crazy story happened over the weekend. I'm your host, Greg Stoker, and if you're new here, come on in. The water's great. And if you're some random bro who has stumbled into the weird left-wing corner of the internet, strap in because it's about to be a whole thing. We've got an interesting show lined up for you tonight, mostly focusing on Israel, the Gaza ceasefire, its creation of chaos in Syria as a means of exploiting unforeseen opportunities in absence of a better plan or a cohesive military plan, and the slow decline of the Israeli social and economic fabric with a former IDF soldier and Israeli dissident who actually considers himself ex-Israeli. So stay tuned for that. It's a really interesting conversation. Real quick, we generally have a live Q&A, but I have to go do adult life stuff, which I really hate doing, but I can't be here for it. So I have to be somewhere at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard, but this should still have the live chat. Sorry about that. We'll be back next week with that, but hopefully you guys can talk in the comments. So I am compelled to do the Patreon plug. So Mint Press News is a small independent newsroom, demonetized on all platforms, heavily censored and shadow banned, especially here on YouTube and X, obviously. So I know a lot of you watch the live on X, shadow banned there as well. So if you can engage in the comments, like, share, and subscribe. And if you even want to do more than that because you're awesome, you could subscribe to our Patreon and help support independent, non-corporate watchdog journalism. So I just do the show on Mondays, but there's a lot of great staff members and staff writers who do work here and could use your support. So before we get to Israel, plug over. The other big story this weekend was Ukraine and the massive shift in foreign policy that happened after the Trump versus Zelensky spat in the Oval Office. And look, every time I talk about the Russia-Ukraine thing, what I mean is the devastating war of attrition that has gone on for 3 years now. I think the beginning of last week was the 3rd year anniversary. It's a complicated issue. There's a lot of conflicting feelings about it. I'm not here to tell Ukrainians what they should do. I know Trump in the White House tried to frame it as if Zelensky was deeply unpopular. Most polls I've seen is that he's actually polling higher than Trump is right now amongst the Ukrainian people, and that at least 50% of Ukrainians support the war continuing. However, there are complicated parameters around any sort of polls in Ukraine, because are they Western Ukrainians who are affluent, who are middle class or upper middle class, who can either leave the country or can dodge conscription? That's another complicating parameter. But all I'm going to say is that catch a lot of heat for talking about the imperial origins of the war in Ukraine. I am an anti-war combat veteran who is very critical of U.S. imperialism, NATO expansionism. So that's all I'm focusing on. Just like I don't tell the Palestinians what they need to do for their liberation, I just remark on Western complicity and what's going on. I'm not doing the same thing for Ukrainians, okay? But if you really want to be critical of someone and you support not necessarily the war in Ukraine, that's the wrong framing, but a vision of Ukrainian liberation from what you see as Russian imperialism, then look, don't be mad at me. Like, listen to the Trump administration. It's kind of a different policy where he's trying to end the war, but also doing it in a very imperial way. Different strokes for different folks, but it is clearly still the empire. Here is Tommy Tuberville, Senator Tommy Tuberville, today talking about how Trump and Putin are actually going to decide the fate of Ukraine, not the Ukrainians.
Zelensky, for some reason, wants this war to keep going, and he has been, I guess, brainwashed by the globalist socialist group in Europe, and even some over here, that, hey, just keep this thing going.
Wow. Typical Republican senator not knowing what socialists want. I don't know a single socialist that supports the war in Ukraine continuing. But yes, that's their main line, painting socialists, communists as these massive warmongers who want to overthrow Western society and democracy. But anyways, it's complete brain rot, but let's keep going.
We'll keep funneling money to you, but they couldn't be more wrong. President Trump is tired of people dying, our American taxpayer dollars going over there, and so he'll try to get this finished. But Zelensky's going to play hardball. But you know what? He's not even in the game. It's going to be Putin and President Trump and the people on our side that will end up making this decision for the future of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think in the end, the shrieking, chain-rattling ghost of Henry Kissinger is always right when he says, when he said that to be America's enemy is dangerous, to be America's friend is deadly. He also said America has no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. So I've said this before. I think they're learning what it means. Them in Europe is learning what it means to be Kurdish. The U.S. empire will always sell you out during the new administration and their new interests. But the one through line is imperialism and domination. So before we move on to the segment with Israel, let's just talk about Europe coming together and trying to chart a way forward, still wanting to fund Ukraine and not necessarily end the war, perhaps put in peacekeepers, but we're seeing a shift, a breaking of the transatlantic alliance between Europe and the United States.
We start this morning with scenes of unity in Europe as leaders gathered in London and stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It contrasted sharply with the disunity at the White House on Friday as a meeting in the Oval Office descended into a shouting match between President Trump, Vice President Vance, and President Zelensky, with questions now being asked about whether an economic deal is still on the table.
All President Zelensky had to do was come in and sign this economic agreement and, again, show no daylight between Ukrainian people and the American people, and he chose to blow that up.
So the deal is no longer on the table, just to be abundantly clear.
Not at present.
All right, for more on this, let's bring in.
So we're kind of saying yes, how do I frame this? Okay, so what we've said multiple times over the past year that we've had this show is that Netanyahu is the one who can end the Israeli project. Not because he wants to, just because it's so brash and reckless and heedless, and he only does what's in the best interest of him and his buddies. And Trump's like that. If one person can quickly dismantle the American empire, it's Trump. We were just literally alienating our vassal states in Europe. And I talked about this yesterday on my own podcast, Colonial Outcast, that what the United States generally needs Europe for is not military power. What we need them for is legitimacy. We need them for coalition task force. So what do we need with 3,000 Brits in Afghanistan and a few thousand Frenchmen and a couple companies of Czech soldiers? Nothing. But they give us legitimacy. Trump has just ripped the mask off and said, we don't need anyone else. Might makes right, peace through strength, and we're going to do what we're going to do. However, we no longer have the staying power of the 80s or the 90s. And the global order, the unipolar order that we all grew up with, is fracturing in real time faster than I thought it would. So to that end, we touched on Ukraine. Sorry, the interview went longer than I thought about Israel. So we're going to put a cap on that, maybe revisit it next week if there's new developments. But we are going to shift focus to another aspect of the American empire, and that is our colony in the Eastern Mediterranean that actually projects more political power over us than any colony has in previous history. So let's get into it. Tonight on Mint Press News, for our main segment, we are going to be discussing developments in Israel and Syria. So to give you a little introduction into what that is, I'll say this, quote, Gaza truce hangs by a thread as Israel sets new conditions. That was actually a CNN headline from this morning. And as far as CNN headlines about the unprecedented violence in Gaza, it's not that bad, since it at least admits that the Israeli government is the one moving the goalposts on this next phase, stage 2 of the ceasefire deal. So it was certainly better than the New York Times article from yesterday, quote, Israel halts aid into Gaza and proposes new framework. for an end to the war, which I had to correct to Israel resumes weaponized starvation to collectively punish civilians, force more favorable ceasefire terms, unquote. So this is nothing new. It's been happening like this since spring 2024 of, this back and forth ceasefire drama. But at any rate, let's dive right in and discuss the current state of the ceasefire, Israeli actions in Syria, and the current state of the Israeli economy, society, etc. And we are joined by Alon Mizrahi, ex-Israeli author and dissident, and former member of the IDF, as most Israelis are forced to be. Thank you so much for coming on this morning and talking.
Thanks for having me, Greg. Love your work.
Really appreciate that. So, I am a former U.S. veteran turned anti-war activist. I know that you were in the IDF when you were younger. I was wondering if you, before we dive right in, if you could do like 2 minutes condensed version of how you got from there as an Israeli soldier to a dissident and an activist and a writer that you are now.
I'll try to do that. I mean, how I got to the IDF is straightforward. I mean, as almost every Jewish Israeli, teenager and kid, my biggest dream was to be a hero in the IDF and defend the country from terrorists and the Arabs who were always trying to kill us, destroy us, throw us into the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. This was my dream. And it connects with like a terrible understanding of masculinity, okay? This is how you become a man. You become strong and tough and kill bad guys and do what you're told and so on. So this was my dream as a teenager, and I did enlist, and I served for a little over a year in a combat unit, and basically an occupation unit in the West Bank and mostly in Gaza. Mm-hmm. So this was my experience at 18. And really gradually and slowly and then fast, I renounced and became a disbeliever, a heretic, a Zionist heretic. I lost my belief as the contradictions and the inconsistencies and the inhumanity of Zionism and all the secrets it kept hidden. Especially for me as a Mizrahi Jew, as an Arab Jew, this was an always conflicted and troubled aspect of Zionism. But not many people were willing to open this up and look at what it really means. But I did. After a personal tragedy or a series of personal tragedies, I was willing to look at my life like from scratch and figure it out completely without feeling obliged to follow or obey any set of rules or doctrines or ideologies or beliefs. I wanted to figure it all out for myself from the beginning. So I deconstructed, basically my identity became deconstructed and rebuilt. And when I rebuilt my new identity, I didn't want to hate Arabs because I realized I was an Arab. This was the joke. Zionism played on me and on other Mizrahi Jews and Arab Jews. And when I the short version of it, when I became aware of the deception of Zionism, which talks about a one Jewish people, one Jewish group, and it is not true. There are many Jewish groups and many Jewish communities, many with different ideas and concepts of how to be Jewish, what the Jewishness means. When I realized that, the next step was, now I get what Palestinians are going through. When you see your own strangeness, your own alienness, you can recognize other people's experiences. So this is like the short version of what I went through with this. And Israeli society doesn't encourage you, as I'm sure American society doesn't encourage you to do like this self-exploration.
Yeah,
Like,
not at all.
yeah,
So, yeah, in fact, if you do, some self-exploration, you start questioning the systems of power, you're called a terrorist sympathizer or un-American or, yeah,
yeah.
all of that. So, well, thank you so much for that intro. I went through, I wouldn't say like a similar journey, but some things were definitely there. Fourth generation army, couldn't be a man until you've like gotten stuck in the shit. Yeah. And, we had to go fight and kill terrorists overseas because if we didn't do it overseas, they'd come back and another 9/11 would happen. So,
Yeah. Listen, for me, the defining experiences of my military service in Gaza was that I didn't have the words or the understanding for it back then, but psychologically I got that something was wrong. I mean, I was preparing myself to be this big hero soldier, and then I was sent into Gaza to do occupation work, to randomly arrest people, barge into their homes, and do all kind of routine stuff. It was not heroic at all. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with it. Much of the military work is just routine patrols, doing all kinds of everyday stuff, which isn't heroic at all. It's like police in uniform, and a different like twist to it. But it wasn't like I wasn't defending my country. I was in Gaza, in the middle of Gaza, and I didn't have a good idea of what I was supposed to do there.
Yeah. And it kind of seems like over the course of this quote unquote war, it seems like a lot of units within Gaza don't exactly know what they're supposed to do either. They keep going and clearing through these different neighborhoods, and they have to go back in 2 months later. And now that there's a ceasefire, there's still a Israeli military presence inside of Gaza. They've pulled up to the north. They're still on the Egyptian border side of the Rafah crossing or the Philadelphia corridor, and then along the Wadi Gaza, along the Netzarim corridor that bisects North and South Gaza. So just to get started with that, and your experience in Gaza is going to be helpful with this. I just wanted to get everybody updated over the weekend. So the ceasefire deal itself was supposed to take place in three phases. So on January 19th, the first phase of the agreement came into effect. It lasted 42 days and expired this past weekend. So the first phase was intended to free 33 Israeli hostages in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, most of whom who've not been formally charged, and an influx of aid into Gaza. So, the second 42-day ceasefire phase was meant to see a commitment to permanently ending the war, the withdrawal of all Israeli troops from Gaza, and the release of all living hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners and detainees. So the exact details of phase two, and this is where things are getting kind of propagandized, were not meant to have been decided until during the first phase. The second phase was supposed to have begun yesterday. Of course, we've heard reports from the Gaza Health Ministry, different Israeli Telegram channels that they're including the Cradle Media and non-official, non-mainstream media sources that there were attacks, gunfire in Rafah, artillery shells were fired into Gaza. So the ceasefire agreement stipulates that the truce can continue so long as negotiators are talking. The two sides were meant to begin talks on a permanent end of the war in early February. However, weeks have passed and it's unclear if they have started. So basically, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said the proposed extension, which would run through the Islamic month of Ramadan and the Jewish holiday of Passover, was an idea put forward by President Donald Trump, the Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, and of course Passover ends in mid-April. So there has been no word for Witkoff or the Trump administration on the revised plan. It just seems to me that Netanyahu is making it up as it goes. There's been no comment about a revised plan from the White House. And, Israel says Hamas has rejected the proposal and in return halted all humanitarian aid into the Strip. So the Israeli Prime Minister's office said, in light of the Hamas refusal to accept Steve Witkoff's framework for continuing the talks, again, no statement from Witkoff or the White House about this change of plan, which Israel had agreed to. Prime Minister Netanyahu has decided that as of this morning, all entry of goods and supplies into the Gaza Strip will be stopped. So Israel will not, according to them, they would not allow a ceasefire without the release of the remaining hostages, the statement added. So we've seen this kind of tactic before. What's your take on what Benjamin Netanyahu and some of his other more far-right ministers are trying to accomplish with this? I'm going to play a video by Prime Minister Netanyahu to President Trump that he posted yesterday, kind of flattering him. But what do you think is really going on here from your perspective?
I think that Israel is in a situation where it cannot de-escalate. Israel cannot go back to quote-unquote normal. There's no normal anymore for Israel. I mean, Israel has put itself in a position where it cannot even go and pretend to be a normal country anymore. I mean, not for Israelis and not for outsiders. Israel has put itself in a place where the rest of humanity, I mean, let's put aside the lies coming from the US and the Western establishments. The rest of humanity are horrified. And in terms of his internal Israeli dynamics, Netanyahu cannot lead an effort to end the war. It's just impossible for him politically. Because if he ends the war, it means the mission failed. So not only was October 7 a huge failure on the part of the Israeli security establishment and the Israeli state, ending the war without ethnically cleansing Gaza, without gaining territory, without changing strategically Israel's position in the region is a big failure. And mentally, you can't go back from crazy to normal like on a whim because you decide. Israel has decided to go crazy, pursuing this really extermination of Gazans. It can't go back to being normal. So it is Netanyahu's coalition, which is mostly the most extreme right-wingers, religious Jewish fanatics. They want to expand Israel. They want to make Israel this Middle Eastern superpower, much bigger than it is today. And continuing this war and this conflict and always making excuses to do more harm and have more military operations is their way to get to where they want to be for Israel.
But is there a sense, do you believe in the defense establishment, like that they can't actually achieve that? I've been reading like op-eds and Haaretz where even like Ynet News, where they're quoting intelligence veterans and military, like command echelon veterans, that, they can't really defeat Hamas in a conventional way without like literally killing everybody in the Gaza Strip. And can they actually do that? I don't know. Is there a sense of, futility, do you think, that some military planners have within the Israeli military establishment?
This is the almost an original and the original scene of the Israeli security establishment, because it was always trying to portray itself, to present itself as the voice of reason, because they were supposedly professionals, security professionals, and soldiers and spies and so on, and they were supposed to give like the counter position, the counter stance to the messianic ambitions of the right wing. But this is only PR. I mean, in reality, they never said, there was never like a red line for them. When they were tasked with destroying Gaza and bombing Gaza indiscriminately, they did it. They did it. They obeyed the order and they did it. And when they have been told in 1967, this is not new, you are going to be Israel's occupation force in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and Gaza, they went ahead and did it. They didn't tell Israeli political establishments, we cannot do it. As a professional military force and as a society, we cannot commit to such a task because this will destroy us. They never said it. So people like to present this idea of a divide between the military establishment in Israel and the political system, but it doesn't really exist. The military tries to find like the slightest alibi, the minimal fig leaf to preserve its image as a rational organization or rational setup. But eventually they do as they're told. So they are being told to bomb Damascus, bomb wherever, bomb Iran, Yemen, wherever they are told to go and drop bombs, they go ahead and do it. Wherever they're told to occupy, they go ahead and do it. So they may pretend to drag their legs, but they will follow orders.
Yeah.
As obscene as they are going to be.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on to Syria, what's your personal prediction for how this ceasefire is going to turn out? Do you think it's going to keep straggling on, barely held together, very fragile, or do you think it's going to collapse entirely and we're looking at more fighting?
It's interesting because we have now two conflicting forces at play, and I have no idea which one is going to have the upper hand. I mean, Israel wants more war, more occupation, and ideally it wants the US to fight for it as much as possible. So it's Israel's interest, the right wing, which is it became one with the military establishment, to have a big war that the US fights on Israel's behalf, taking on Iran, taking on Yemen, which Israel can't do alone. And this is their political and almost ideological, and it all comes together. They want a bigger war because they need a big victory for the Israeli public, for their own image, which they don't have now. They have no victory. I mean, Hamas is standing. It has terms and conditions. It stipulates. It is strong. It has many people. No defeat.
Right.
So what have they achieved in this genocide, except the destruction of Israel's reputation? They achieved nothing. So it's their interest to have a bigger war. On the other hand, it is not the US interest to be dragged into a bigger war or even as a medium war in the Middle East, because it's not going to play well with the American public.
No, especially after 20 years of the global war on terror that ended very poorly. The Taliban are still in power. Of course, Iraq was settled differently, but there's still open slave markets in Libya. Somalia got bombed. Yemen got bombed. Yeah, it was just a big net loss, and Americans are kind of sick of sending money overseas and investing in wars. Speaking of which, over the past couple weeks, the Trump administration has just authorized another $7 billion of foreign aid to Israel. My question is, if the establishment in Israel and a lot of the population are desperate and looking for a victory, is there any sense that they couldn't actually achieve anything militarily without the unconditional support of the United States? And is that something that weighs on the military pride that they have at all?
Sadly, no. I wish that were the case, but it's not the case. This is where really messy religious ideas come into play. Because
they deserve the aid.
They don't think the US is helping them. They think God is helping them. Maybe through the US, but if not the US, maybe someone else. God will find a way to help them. This is partly suicidal and partly just stupidity. Because this is a different conversation, but if you are a Jewish believer, or you love your Jewishness, all you have to do is look at Jewish history and what happened to Jews when they like when they let it like get to their heads.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't end well for Jews. But I don't know why they decided that the lesson from Jewish history is to become more belligerent and more conflicted and more violent. And I don't know why, but this is the path they chose.
Mm-hmm. So, speaking of that, we were talking about, expanding Israel, fighting a greater war. It seems like they couldn't take any territory in Lebanon. So why not do it in Syria? And I think that's kind of like what we're looking at right now. So to quote from a Times of Israel article published Saturday by Emmanuel Fabian, quote, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz instructed the Israeli Defense Forces on Saturday to, quote, prepare to defend the Druze majority city of Jaramana on the outskirts of Damascus in Syria. A statement issued by Katz's office said the Damascus suburb was currently under attack by the forces of the Syrian regime. There's a lot of contesting what that actually means. So according to reports from Syria, authorities from the new Syrian government have been clashing with local Druze gunmen during a security campaign in that suburb. At least one Syrian officer was killed, while another was captured and later released, the report said. So I think the real takeaway from this is since December, like Israel has made repeated references to religious and ethnic minorities in Syria, including the Kurdish communities and the Druze. And, Pat earlier was saying he was considering allowing the entry of Druze communities from Syria to work in the occupied Golan Heights, which has been occupied since 1967. It's mostly inhabited by the Druze community. And since the fall of Assad, Israel has expanded its control over the Golan Heights, provoking condemnation of the Syrian government, and while also destroying all of its military stockpiles, runways, assets of the new incoming HTS government, which of course we've talked about before. It's inherently problematic. But for me, and this is what I wanted to get your opinion on, this really has the whiff of the doctrine of the periphery, or the alliance of the periphery, that refers to a foreign policy strategy developed by then Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Because like in 1999, Meir Amit, the head of the Mossad, described it, quote, as an alliance with all the actors in the Middle East who are not Muslim Arabs. So just for some context, in the 1950s, the Israeli security was to be ensured by creating alliances with the non-Arab and non-Muslim minorities in Israel's periphery, like surrounding lands, in order to balance the Arab states in Israel's vicinity. So it included states like Turkey and Ethiopia, but Israel also tried to strike alliances with non-Arab and Muslim minorities throughout the region, like Kurds in Iraq and Syria, Maronites in Lebanon, and of course the Druze. So a Balkan, in my personal estimation, and kind of like what I see the fingerprints of here, is a Balkanized Syria with like a client Druze state on Israel's border, and a Kurdish state in the AANES in northern Syria would perfectly suit Israel, and by extension, U.S. interests, because slicing up existing Arab states into smaller states would make it easier for Israel to establish and sustain military hegemony over the region. And, they want the same thing with Iran. There's been talk about like partitioning Iran into 6 different warring states and stuff. So when you see, I was just trying to get your impression of like what the Israeli military agenda is in Syria beyond just a buffer zone and the monopolizing of water resources and the establishment of a secure intelligence post on Mount Hermon. Like, what do you see happening?
When they say, but first I have to say the word alliance is very misleading. This is not an alliance. This is comparable to the U.S. saying it wants to have an alliance with democratic forces in many countries. For instance, Ukraine, Romania, and so on and so on. This is the same. This is not sincere. It's not an alliance, because an alliance implies equality. And Israel doesn't have equality with anyone, not even the U.S., which is seen as its servant, basically. Big, powerful, nevertheless a servant. So it's not an alliance, but Israel doesn't want to, and this is image, maintenance of image, because Israel doesn't want to be, even today's Israel, doesn't want to be seen as just a bully, a whimsical bully, or just hits everyone and shoots and kills. So it needs an excuse for what it's doing. So destabilizing neighboring states allows Israel to say, we are, as Ehud Barak once said, we are a villa in the jungle. So they make sure this remains a jungle. So it's their interest to have infighting between the HTS and the Druze. So I don't want to speculate who was doing the actual shooting, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were Israeli agents, for instance, because it's Israeli interest to have infighting in neighboring states, for Israel to be seen as the force of stability, and they are. This is where you go if you want to have a stable policy. You go to Israel. But when Israel is the one manufacturing the chaos around it, and under this chaos umbrella, Israel is much freer to expand. So, this is the game. You create instability, you create chaos, and then when you come in, when your tanks roll in, they are the power of stability and democracy and progress and all this shit.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the game. This is what I think is the Israeli game right now. And in the background, we always have to remember that many people, maybe not in Israeli society, but in Israeli power structures, there are many religious right-wingers who actually are religiously devoted to the idea of expanding Israel.
Mm-hmm.
They see it as a fulfillment of a biblical promise by God himself. So some of them view it very seriously. So every faction of Israeli society and ideology finds their own vocabulary for doing this. The security establishment says we are improving Israel's security and expanding Israel and bringing peace and stability to the regions, quote unquote, with alliances. And the religious right-wingers say this is us fulfilling God's will, and just the normal Zionist majority says, oh, okay, this is reality. We just follow along. Well, what's happening? We remain loyal to the state of Israel. Yeah. So this is how no opposition ever emerges to whatever Israel is doing.
I've also interviewed some what we could call more like liberal Zionists, from the Tel Avivians.
Yeah.
And what they say is we're here, Muslim extremists, Islamists, there's this certain way. We're the only democracy here. Of course, things we've all heard before, but if we're in Syria, it's because we need to protect these vulnerable communities, the Druze and the Maronites and the Kurds from the big bad Arabs.
And by the way, Israel did the exact same thing with Lebanon in the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they installed a puppet government headed by Christians, and this ended so badly for Israel. But they never learned, just as the U.S. never learns. I mean, they went to Afghanistan and Iraq, and so I mean, they leave behind destruction. They gain nothing, but the momentum never seems to stop.
Well, yeah. I mean, it definitely helps when you're unconditionally funded by the most powerful empire in human history. So, now that we've gone, so just for the record, it kind of seems like your take on the Syria thing is we're creating chaos. We're not really sure what the plan is, but if opportunities present themselves, we're going to capitalize on them.
Precisely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, that's what it looks like as an outsider, because their statements, they have no real mission statements. They said they've accomplished this and that, and it kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you remember when during the Iraq War when Bush landed on the aircraft carrier with the mission accomplished sign.
Yeah. I remember that.
It definitely reminds me of something similar. So
and I have to add to it. Israel can't just annex parts of Syria or Jordan or Egypt. You need to create the framework, the political, the normative framework for doing something this unprecedented, this brazen. So this is they're working towards that.
Mm-hmm. So
now, so if they have the excuse of the Druze, we are defending the Druze, and this is a temporary occupation to defend minorities in Syria, then it sounds different than just annexation.
Right, and technically they haven't annexed the Golan Heights; they're just occupying it.
For
their own safety.
And the U.S. is the only country that recognizes this occupation of the Golan Heights. And even with today, like with this slave mentality of Western powers, Israel cannot just annex. This is like a red line for other countries. I mean, the UK or France or Germany cannot say, okay, Israel is allowed to expand into Syria. They can't say that. They can't.
So, yeah, but they'll keep trying to play it both ways and straddle both sides of the fence, supporting Israel while pretending to care about international law. So, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, although certain things are starting to happen, which kind of reminds me of what happened in the later days of South African apartheid, like research grants for Israel, like Israeli professors are getting canceled in Europe. Their universities are cutting ties with their sister universities in like Tel Aviv and Haifa. And it's kind of somewhat getting normalized, even in academic institutions in Europe and the United States, which have historically been very Zionist. So that's interesting as well to look at. And is there any sense for the last segment about like the Israeli economy and society, is there any sense that, do you believe, and of course, Israelis and Israeli society isn't a monolith. There's a bunch of different types of people with different views. You can see that in Hebrew media because it's a very vibrant discourse and argument between different journalists and newspapers and things like that, more so than I would say in the United States. But is there a sense that they're being isolated from the rest of the world slowly over what's happening?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, the Israeli media is very controlled. I mean, narrative control is very strong. It's strong in the US, it's strong in Israel. But I mean, having lived there for so many years and having a critical look at things, I can see where the system is trying to warn people that something serious may be happening in a very subdued and subtle way, not to cause panic, not to cause hysteria, not to allow for a really open debate to happen, because we don't want that. But I can read. I'm not a big reader of like financial journalism, but I can see that, for instance, Israeli economy is contracting. It's not growing, which is very bad for Israel. I mean, it needs to expand all the time to make its lifestyle, sustainable. And the other thing is, like, there are two sectors of the Israeli economy which have contributed most to the economic boom in Israel. One is high tech, the other is real estate. And over the 25 years or so, prices in both sectors and prices and have gone up all the time. I mean, prices of real estate and the number of people employed in high tech and the export have grown all the time, almost exponentially. But this is not talked about much, but I can see hints, more than hints. I mean, people in high places saying this openly, that this momentum has stalled, or maybe stopped, or even reversed. It's the first time as an adult that I hear that real estate prices in Israel are beginning to drop. This is a big event. This is not something small. And the other thing is, the Israeli high-tech sector is no longer expanding, not in terms of its like absolute financial contribution, and also in terms of the number of people employed in this sector. So this is not yet like a crisis, but these are like structural warning signs that something serious is happening. And of course, there was a big piece in Haaretz a few days last week about more and more Israeli researchers and academics being silently boycott, because what are you going to do about it? I mean, you can't do. If I see a panel with a Zionist in it, I may decide I don't want to go, and I may not declare it, but I won't feel comfortable to sit next to a person who supports genocide. And there are many people in the academic community and cultural institutions who don't feel comfortable with what Israel is doing, to put it mildly. So they just avoid. They don't want to work with Israelis. They don't want to be in panels with Israelis. They don't want to write research papers with Israelis. So this is a kind of a silent ban. It's not like proclaimed openly, but I think that many people already practice it. And artists don't want to perform in Israel. Someone like a big name comes to Israel, they make a big deal out of it. But what I hear is all the people who don't want to come to Israel and don't want to be identified with Israel. And maybe they are not comfortable enough with openly criticizing Israel, but they don't want to be identified with it.
Yeah. No, we'll just pass on the Tel Aviv show and go to Turkey.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I don't know. It's kind of mind blowing to me, because it's like I realize as an American that we're not very popular right now. And I live in Texas, close to the Mexico border. And if I went to Mexico City right now with all the ICE raids happening and all the deportations, just because I look Germanic as hell, I would probably hear about it. I would get stares. I would, even though I don't support our immigration policy at all or the U.S. government at all, there's still a sense that, I would be very unpopular. And are you saying that there's not really a sense among a lot of Israelis that that's where they're going?
This is tricky. The difference is Americans weren't brought up to believe they are globally hated, and this is just fate. Whereas Jewish Zionists do.
Okay.
This is so nothing's changed. This even in a sick way. This is what I wrote about like a year ago. I said it is one of the reasons Netanyahu is pushing this paranoid, belligerent line is that it rewards his camp of Jewish paranoia politically, because more and more when people there's this silent ban, and people are going to start avoiding even Jewish therapists, for instance. No one is going to report about this, but maybe people will not be comfortable to sit and talk to a therapist who supports the mass murder of children. I mean, it's not like a big stretch of the imagination to think this happens or may happen. So, and people would start maybe avoiding some Jewish businesses who are like openly identified with Israel and the genocide. So, and this would be the natural course of event. This is like normal human behavior. But as this will happen more and more, what the Netanyahu, what the paranoia camp will say is, you see, they hate us. You see, they never liked us. Now they have an excuse, but they always hated us, just like we told you. This is and I've used this metaphor a few times before. This is like an abusive parent who blocks you out from having like meaningful interactions and connections socially. And when people start behaving like they're not sure about you, they tell you, you see, no one loves you.
Right.
And this is what they're doing now.
So that's kind of like interesting. I'm not sure if you said it explicitly, but in terms of becoming more and more like a lot less popular globally, and I know that one of the things that's important to wealthy Israelis is being like globetrotters. You travel the world extensively, and if you become more and more less popular, it might not register to them because they already have the idea that they already hate us anyways. They don't hate us any more than they did before. Is that fair to say?
Not exactly, because this is again a very good question, because for most Israelis, they don't get it.
Mhm.
They don't get it. They live in this bubble because they are not globetrotters. They live in Israel mostly. They are exposed to Israeli media and to Jewish education and to this paranoia. They don't question it. But the more affluent and mobile set of Israelis who are mostly Ashkenazi Jews, white European Jews, okay? And this is a very interesting question, and I've been thinking about this a lot, because what will this sector of Israel, and this is like the 5 or 10% of Israel, which makes the building stands.
Mhm.
If they don't cooperate, if they decide to move out, if they like relocate, even in a like semi-relocate, like a soft relocation, move some of the finances, move some of the where they live outside of Israel, Israel is going to collapse rapidly. It won't be able to pay its bills even, because the wealth and connections and knowledge and know-how, everything that connects the Israeli machine together is this sector of the population. And they are better educated, they have the means, and they have a lot to lose, as opposed to many other Israelis who don't think they have a lot to lose, but they do. But this group of people know they have a lot to lose. If the Israel's image continues to deteriorate, if they become actually hated, if they start to lose money, which they hate, which they really hate, if they start to lose money, I mean, this is just capitalist. They have values, but when they start to lose money, they frown upon like the political arrangement. So this is a big question, because, and when I was still in Tel Aviv, like this has been going on for a long time, and even before the genocide, we have to remember the endless Netanyahu reign really make a lot of people despair of Israel and its prospect, because they could see that it's not going to be a liberal country, it's not going to be secular, it's going to be religious, violent, belligerent. The occupation is going to go on forever. Racism is on the rise. So the talk of leaving Israel and leaving Tel Aviv was, I could hear it for years, but now it's becoming more. I mean, every family in Tel Aviv has someone who left Israel already.
Yeah.
So it's not yet. It's still a trickle, but it's a meaningful trickle already, and it's growing and it's growing and it's growing. So it just, I mean, when you consider all this data, I mean, the economy, the reputation, the how impossible it is to achieve what the right wingers want and Netanyahu wants. When you consider all of it, you just don't get how they don't get it. But they don't. They pursue the same stupid strategy. They ignore every aspect of reality, and everything tells them this is a bad way to go. This is a bad way to go. I mean, I am not sure even. I think that even the American right wing is ripe. I mean, if Donald Trump says, and I'm serious, if Donald Trump says, we have given Israel everything, but they are ungrateful and they don't know what to do with it, and we need to stop. If Donald Trump says it, people will toe the line. They will follow his lead, because people are starting to feel like they've had enough with this ally and all this nonsense. But it costs too much, it starts to cost too much, this Zionist project. And I think that the American public, lefties even more so, but also Republicans are beginning to feel ripe for a break. And this is going to be a huge blow for Israel.
Yeah.
There's a, yeah.
And no, and if we accept just the basic through line of colonial history throughout the colonial era, and if we accept the argument that Israel is a colony, it's kind of unique in a way because no colony that had its own like independence necessarily, but also impacted the politics of the empire itself as much as Israel does. But accepting that, like once the rich elite start to leave, and once people in the core stop wanting to fund it, that's kind of like the slow beginning of the end. And I did my focus in post-colonial studies in college on the British Raj, and once that begins, there's no really way to prevent it. I think the American empire is on terminal decline, and I don't see how Israel in its current manifestation is sustainable for another 100 years.
Not even a decade.
You don't think so?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, not even a decade. This is too many factors are so negative. So I think Israel, people who are like leading the Israeli ship are already feeling it, like the tremors. They don't necessarily like communicate this out, but I think they feel it, and you need to add to it. I mean, the other thing we didn't speak about. I mean, the people who die in Gaza, people who die in Israel's wars, are not mostly members of the Ashkenazi elite.
I've noticed that. There's the same sort of a casualty gap in the American military where it's poor people. I mean, like white dudes from the trailer park and
Hispanic. Black and Hispanics, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So this part of Israeli population is also starting to slowly, because they are not very quick and they are heavily indoctrinated and decultured as Arab Jews and brainwashed. But what do we get from this? What do we get from this? I mean, in high tech, people become millionaires and billionaires, and people buy those fancy homes in Tel Aviv and in Manhattan and Los Angeles and other places. But what do we get from it?
You get a medal.
Yeah,
your legs.
Yeah. And this is not a good answer. Not for a long time, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting to think about. 10 years, that seems optimistic, but hey, you may be right. People have gotten educated about Israel very quickly over the past year and a half.
And listen, this scenario doesn't take into account a war with Iran, which I think is going to just finish Israel in weeks, not years, in weeks, because until now, Israel mostly Israeli infrastructure. I mean, the power grid didn't go down. The seaports didn't close. The airport. But if this happens, and Iran will do it to Israel, I have no doubt. If in case of a serious war, they have the capability.
Yes, they do. We saw that during the two Operation True Promises, where they penetrated air defenses and put rounds on Natal Air Force Base and some other locations.
Yeah, and Iran has performed like a mass coordinated drone attack on Saudi Arabia like 6 or 7 years ago. They are they know what they're doing. So if this kind of a drastic scenario happens, this is going to accelerate things to a different scale altogether.
Yeah. Well, we will wait and see how insane the Netanyahu administration gets and how destructive they want to do it. Of course, it's been Netanyahu's career-long fever dream to get the United States to bomb Iran on behalf of Israel. I don't think that's going to happen based off of what Trump wants to do and his positioning right now with winding down the war in Ukraine and shifting towards China, trying to isolate China. We'll basically probably just see from the United States the resurrection of his crap. Why am I mind blanking? maximum pressure campaign with sanctions and trade restrictions and everything like that. So we'll see. We'll see if Netanyahu gets what he wants. We'll see if the ceasefire falls through. But thanks for coming on to talk to us about what's going on in Gaza, your interpretation of what the IDF is trying to do in Syria, which is basically create chaos and try to exploit it where you can, and the current state of Israeli society. Alon Mizrahi, thank you so much for coming on. You can
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah,
my pleasure.
And you can find him on social media in the description. Thanks so much, y'all, and we will see you on the next one here at Min Press News.
Thanks. Bye-bye.